Alexander the Great, the man who would be God. Chapter 1. Birth of Legend. Lightning split the Macedonian sky on the night Alexander was born in 356 BCE, illuminating Mount Olympus with savage brilliance. In later years, those who witnessed that storm would swear the thunder itself had announced his coming. The air crackled with portents. Two eagles perched on the palace roof, ancient symbols of dual empire that seemed to prophesy dominion over both Europe and Asia. But perhaps the most striking omen occurred hundreds of miles away, where the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The temple's destruction was no accident. A man named Herostratus, desperate for immortality, had set the fire deliberately. When captured and tortured, he admitted he had done it purely for fame. The Ephesian authorities, disgusted by his motive, forbade anyone from ever speaking his name, a ban so ineffective that we remember him still. The priests of Artemis, however, saw deeper meaning in the timing. They declared that their goddess had been absent from her temple that night, too busy attending the birth of Alexander to prevent its destruction. On that same night, Philip II of Macedon received 3 messages. His general Parmenion had won a great victory against the Illyrians. His horses had won at the Olympic Games, and his wife Olympias had borne him a son. The triple victory seemed to mark the child for greatness, though none could have guessed just how far that greatness would reach. Alexander's parents were themselves extraordinary figures whose tempestuous relationship would shape both their son's character and the course of history. Philip II had transformed Macedonia from what the Greeks dismissed as a backwater kingdom into the most formidable military power in the world. Born a younger prince, he had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes, where he studied under the brilliant general Epaminondas. There he learned the military innovations that he would later perfect: the close coordination infantry tactics, the integrated use of cavalry, and the importance of professional training. But Philip was far more than a military innovator. He was a diplomatic genius who could shift from brutal conqueror to charming negotiator as circumstances required. He built alliances through a combination of threats, bribes, and marriages, earning him the sardonic praise that no fortress was impregnable if a mule laden with gold could reach it. He modernized Macedonia's government, standardized its currency, and began transforming its capital Pella from a muddy fortress into a center of culture and learning. Olympias was every bit Philip's equal in force of personality, though her power expressed itself differently. A princess of Epirus, she traced her bloodline to Achilles through her father's line and claimed descent from Helen of Troy through her mother's. More than mere ancestry connected her to these legendary figures. Olympias possessed a mystical intensity that made even hardened Macedonian warriors uneasy. She was an initiate of mystery cults devoted to Dionysus and the snake-handling Orphic mysteries. During religious festivals, she would dance through the forests at night with serpents twined around her, earning both reverence and fear from those who witnessed these ceremonies. Their marriage had begun passionately but grown increasingly strained. Philip's numerous political marriages, he would eventually take 7 wives, and his drinking bouts tested Olympias's fierce pride. She countered by spinning ever more elaborate tales about Alexander's divine parentage, claiming that Zeus himself had sired her son in the form of a serpent. Whether she believed these stories or simply used them to protect her position is impossible to know, but their effect on young Alexander was profound. From his earliest years, Alexander was marked as extraordinary. His eyes, one blue and one brown, seemed to pierce through whoever he gazed upon. He carried himself with uncanny self-possession, receiving Persian ambassadors at age 10 with the gravity of a born ruler. These diplomats would later report to their king that the boy was the king, but Philip was merely archon, magistrate. Yet Alexander was no mere prodigy of statecraft. His energy was legendary even in childhood. When Persian envoys visited Macedonia, they found themselves fielding questions not about gold or luxury goods, but about road systems, military organization, and the distances to various provinces. Young Alexander's disappointment was palpable when he feared his father would conquer everything before leaving anything for him to achieve. His education matched his natural gifts. Philip, determined his heir would have advantages he had lacked, assembled an extraordinary team of tutors. Leonidas, a strict disciplinarian and relative of Olympias, trained him in physical fitness with brutal running regimes. Lysimachus encouraged his love of Homer by calling him Achilles during their lessons, while Alexander dubbed his tutor Phoenix after the hero's mentor. But the most significant influence came when Philip persuaded Aristotle himself to oversee his son's education. The philosopher arrived in Macedonia in 343 BCE, when Alexander was 13. Philip provided them the sanctuary of Mieza, a temple complex where Alexander and a select group of noble youths, including many who would later become his greatest generals, studied everything from ethics to biology, from poetry to politics. Aristotle's influence on Alexander was profound and complex. He taught the prince to analyze and categorize, to seek underlying principles behind natural phenomena. He introduced him to advanced mathematical concepts and cutting-edge scientific theories. But perhaps most importantly, Aristotle gave Alexander a framework for understanding the world, a belief that everything, from the movement of stars to the behavior of men, followed comprehensible patterns. He also provided Alexander with an edited copy of Homer's Iliad, which became his constant companion. Alexander slept with this book under his pillow alongside his dagger, a combination that perfectly symbolized his twin loves of culture and conquest. Yet even as he absorbed Aristotle's teachings, Alexander sometimes challenged his mentor's assumptions. When Aristotle spoke of the natural inferiority of non-Greeks, Alexander would point to examples of wisdom and courage among the barbarian peoples his father had encountered. Where his teacher saw sharp distinctions between Greeks and others, Alexander increasingly imagined the possibility of synthesis, a worldview that would later shape his entire approach to empire. Even during these early years, Alexander was already proving himself in battle. At 16, while Philip was away campaigning, he served as regent and crushed a rebellion of the Maedi, establishing his first colony and immodestly naming it Alexandropolis. When some dismissed this as a minor victory against barbarians, Alexander's response was telling, "They may be barbarians, but I have made them live in cities and taught them to honor the gods." His true military genius first revealed itself at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, when he was just 18. Leading the cavalry on the left wing of his father's army, Alexander executed a feigned retreat that drew the Theban sacred band, Greece's most elite unit, out of position. Then, at the perfect moment, he wheeled his cavalry around and smashed into their exposed flank. The sacred band fought to the last man, but their destruction marked the end of Greek independence and the beginning of Macedonian hegemony. Chapter 2. The Price of Power. In the summer of 336 BCE, Macedonia was preparing for its greatest triumph. Philip had united the Greek world under his leadership through a combination of military might and diplomatic manipulation. His planned invasion of Persia promised glory and riches beyond imagination. The wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympias' brother, was meant to be a celebration of Macedonian power, with games, sacrifices, and performances that would rival anything seen in Athens or Delphi. Philip entered the theatre at Aigai in a white cloak, deliberately walking apart from his bodyguards to show his trust in the Greeks gathering to honor him. It was a fatal mistake. A young nobleman named Pausanias rushed forward and thrust a Celtic sword into the king's chest. As Philip collapsed, Pausanias ran for horses stationed outside, but tripped on a vine root and was killed by pursuing guards. The assassination's true architects remained a mystery that would spark centuries of debate. Some suspected Olympias, furious at being displaced by Philip's new young wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. Others pointed to Persian gold or to Alexander himself, eager for power. The truth died with Pausanias, but Alexander's actions in the following days revealed both his political instincts and his ruthlessness. While others stood paralyzed by shock, Alexander moved with lightning speed. He donned his father's armor and rallied the companion cavalry, the elite unit he had led at Chaeronea, to secure the city. His supporters spread word that Pausanias had been part of a Persian plot, while Alexander publicly honored his father and ordered a magnificent funeral. Meanwhile, potential rivals began dying under suspicious circumstances. Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant son were allegedly murdered on Olympias' orders, while Alexander's cousin Amyntas and 2 princes of Lyncestis were executed for suspected involvement in Philip's death. Alexander was now king, but his position was far from secure. He was only 20 years old, and Macedonia's hold over Greece had been built on Philip's personal relationships and feared military presence. News of Philip's death sent ripples of hope through the Greek cities. Thebes and Athens began negotiating an anti-Macedonian alliance. Tribal peoples along Macedonia's northern borders prepared for invasion. The Persian Empire's spies reported that Macedonia would be too busy with internal struggles to pursue Philip's planned invasion. They had all fatally underestimated Alexander. Within 2 weeks of his father's death, he forced the Thessalian League to acknowledge him as leader. He then marched south with stunning speed, arriving at Thermopylae before the Greek cities could organize resistance. In a speech to the Amphictyonic Council, he mixed threats with promises, presenting himself as the champion of Greek unity against Persia. Most cities submitted, but rumors of rebellion continued to circulate. The true test came in 335 BCE, when Thebes, spurred by false reports of Alexander's death in Illyria, declared independence. Alexander's response would shock the Greek world and establish the pattern of his future campaigns. Lightning speed combined with overwhelming force. He covered 300 miles in just 13 days, appearing before Thebes' walls before they could properly prepare their defenses. Even then, Alexander initially offered mercy if the city would surrender. The Thebans responded by demanding he surrender to them and declaring their intention to free Greece from Macedonian tyranny. It was a fatal miscalculation. Alexander unleashed his army on the city with explicit orders to make an example of it. The destruction of Thebes was total. 6,000 inhabitants died in the initial assault. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city itself was razed to the ground, its ancient walls and temples pulled down stone by stone. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, a gesture that emphasized Alexander's self-image as both destroyer and cultural preserver. The message to the rest of Greece was clear. Resistance would bring swift and terrible punishment. With Greece pacified, Alexander began preparing for the invasion of Persia. He inherited from Philip an army that represented a revolution in military organization. The core was the Macedonian phalanx, armed with sarissas, pikes up to 18 feet long that allowed them to outreach any opposing infantry. The elite companion cavalry provided heavy shock troops that could shatter enemy formations with the force of their charge. Light infantry, archers, and siege engineers gave the army unprecedented flexibility. But Alexander's greatest inheritance was less tangible: the loyalty of commanders like Parmenion, Cletus the Black, and Antipater, who had served his father. Many were old enough to be Alexander's father themselves, and some initially doubted whether this golden-haired youth could fill Philip's shoes. Alexander would prove himself not just their equal, but their superior, though this very success would eventually strain these relationships to breaking point. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with approximately 48,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The relatively small size of his army, Persia could theoretically field 10 times as many troops, reflected both the limitations of ancient logistics and Alexander's emphasis on speed and mobility. Upon reaching the Asian shore, he hurled his spear into the ground, claiming Asia as land won by the spear. It was a gesture worthy of Homer's heroes, and Alexander consciously modeled himself after Achilles throughout his campaigns. The first test came at the river Granicus, where Persian satraps had assembled an army to stop his advance. Traditional Greek generals might have hesitated. The Persians held the high ground on the far bank, and the river's swift current made crossing treacherous. But Alexander saw that the Persian position, while strong against a frontal assault, left them no room to maneuver. He ordered an immediate attack. The Battle of Granicus revealed both Alexander's tactical genius and his personal courage, or reckless bravery, depending on one's perspective. Leading the companion cavalry, he charged across the river directly at the Persian centre. In the desperate melee that followed, Alexander's life was saved twice. Once, when Cletus the Black cut off the arm of a Persian noble about to strike him from behind, and again, when his linothorax armour barely deflected a battle axe that split his helmet. This willingness to risk his life alongside his men would prove one of Alexander's greatest strengths and weaknesses. It inspired fanatical loyalty. Soldiers would follow a king who shared their dangers, but it also repeatedly risked the entire enterprise on a single sword thrust. Some, like Parmenion, urged him to be more cautious, but Alexander understood the psychological impact of his actions. He was creating his own legend with every battle. Chapter 3: Empire of Dreams. After Granicus, Alexander moved through Asia Minor with calculated precision. Each city that surrendered was treated with mercy. Each that resisted faced destruction. At Miletus and Halicarnassus, he demonstrated his mastery of siege warfare, using innovative artillery and engineering techniques that would have impressed even his father. But it was at Gordium that he performed the act that would become legendary. The ancient capital of Phrygia housed the famous Gordian knot, bound to a wagon in the Temple of Zeus. According to prophecy, whoever could untie the impossibly complex knot would become ruler of Asia. After examining the knot, which had defeated centuries of attempts to unravel it, Alexander drew his sword and cut through it in a single stroke. Whether this constituted solving the prophecy or cheating it became a matter of debate, but the gesture perfectly embodied Alexander's approach to obstacles: direct, dramatic, and utterly effective. The decisive confrontation with Darius III came at Issus in 333 BCE. The Persian king had assembled an army of perhaps 100,000 men in a narrow plain between mountains and sea, terrain that negated his numerical advantage. More critically, he positioned himself north of Alexander's army, cutting off their supply lines, but also his own route back to Persia's heartland. Alexander could scarcely believe his enemy's tactical error. According to Arrian, he sacrificed to the gods in gratitude for having delivered Darius into his hands. The resulting battle demonstrated the full maturity of Alexander's tactical genius. Recognizing that Darius had posted his best troops, Greek mercenaries, in the center, Alexander executed a complex oblique advance with his phalanxes, refusing his left wing while he led the companion cavalry in a devastating charge aimed directly at Darius's position. The psychological warfare was as carefully planned as the tactics. Alexander knew that Persian armies traditionally collapsed if their king fled, so he made Darius himself the target. The Persian king, seeing the terrifying sight of Alexander's cavalry charging straight for him while the Macedonian phalanxes threatened to outflank his position, lost his nerve and fled. His army, despite its superior numbers, disintegrated. The aftermath of Issus revealed both Alexander's ambition and his growing sense of destiny. Among the captured Persian camp followers were Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander treated them with extraordinary courtesy, addressing Darius's mother Sisygambes as mother and ensuring they maintained their royal lifestyle. When shown some exquisite Persian textiles, he sent them to his own mother, only to learn that they had been woven by Darius's daughters. Alexander immediately apologized for causing them the indignity of slave labor, a gesture that so impressed Sisygambes that she would later choose suicide upon hearing of Alexander's death rather than face losing his protection. Rather than pursue Darius immediately, Alexander turned south toward Phoenicia and Egypt. This seeming detour reflected deep strategic thinking. He refused to advance further into the Persian heartland while leaving potential naval bases for the Persian fleet in his rear. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE demonstrated both his determination and his engineering genius. When the island city proved unreachable by his army, he ordered the construction of a causeway across the sea itself. The project seemed impossible. The water was up to 20 feet deep, and the Tyrians conducted constant raids on the construction crews. Alexander solved these problems with characteristic thoroughness. He built massive mobile towers to protect his workers and gathered every ship he could find to blockade the city. After 7 months, his forces finally breached the walls. His treatment of Tyre, executing thousands and selling the rest into slavery, marked a turning point. The merciful conqueror of Asia Minor was becoming something harder, more imperial. The contrast was evident in his treatment of Jerusalem and Egypt. According to Jewish tradition, Alexander spared Jerusalem after the high priest showed him prophecies in the book of Daniel that predicted his conquests. Whether this actually happened is less important than what it reveals about Alexander's growing reputation. He was increasingly seen as an instrument of divine will rather than merely a successful general. Egypt welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. The priests at the Oracle of Siwa declared him son of Zeus Ammon, validating his claims of divine parentage. This recognition marked a crucial psychological moment. Alexander was no longer simply playing the role of a living god, but perhaps beginning to believe it himself. The human cost of these successes was becoming evident. The core of Macedonian veterans who had crossed the Hellespont with him were being steadily depleted by casualties and garrison duties. Alexander increasingly relied on local recruits trained in Macedonian tactics, a pragmatic solution that nonetheless caused growing tension with his traditional Macedonian officers. These tensions erupted into the open after the decisive Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Here, on an open plain chosen by Darius, Alexander faced the full might of the Persian Empire. The Persian army, numbering perhaps 250,000 men, included fearsome war elephants and scythed chariots. Darius had even ordered the ground leveled to allow his chariots maximum effectiveness. Alexander's response combined tactical brilliance with calculated psychological warfare. He spent days carefully studying the battlefield and Darius's preparations. The night before the battle, while Darius kept his army awake and standing in formation fearing a night attack, Alexander ordered his men to rest. When his generals, particularly Parmenion, suggested a night attack, Alexander famously replied, "I will not steal my victory." The battle itself was a masterpiece of coordination and timing. Alexander refused his right wing, drawing Darius's forces to extend themselves, then led his companion cavalry in a massive wedge charge aimed at a weak point in the Persian line. When Darius saw the dreaded sight of Alexander charging directly for his position again, he fled, just as Alexander had predicted he would. The victory at Gaugamela made Alexander the master of the Persian Empire, but it marked the beginning of profound changes in both his character and his conception of rule. He began adopting Persian customs and dress, presenting himself to his new subjects as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid dynasty rather than merely a conqueror. This cultural flexibility, shocking to traditional Macedonians, reflected both political pragmatism and Alexander's growing vision of a unified empire that transcended traditional Greek-Persian division. Chapter 4. The Weight of Glory. The conquest of Persia marked not just a military triumph, but a dangerous turning point in Alexander's psychological development. In rapid succession, he occupied Babylon, Susa, and Bucephalus, cities of legendary wealth that had previously existed for Greeks only in travelers' tales. The treasure he captured was beyond counting. 120,000 talents at Bucephalus alone, enough to fund his entire army for decades. The burning of Bucephalus in 330 BCE became one of the most debated episodes of his campaign. According to some accounts, Alexander ordered the destruction of the Persian capital's palace complex during a drunken revel, urged on by an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who called it revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Others suggest it was a calculated political statement marking the end of the old Persian order. The truth may combine both explanations. Alexander was increasingly prone to dramatic gestures that merged personal impulse with political symbolism. His pursuit of Darius, who had fled east after Gaugamela, revealed both his relentless determination and the growing strain on his army. They covered 1,500 miles in 30 days, a march that killed many horses and left his men exhausted. When they finally caught up with Darius, they found him already dead, murdered by his own satrap Bessus. Alexander's treatment of Darius's corpse, wrapping it in his own cloak and arranging a royal funeral, demonstrated his growing identification with Persian kingship. This cultural transformation accelerated after Darius's death. Alexander began wearing the striped tunic, diadem, and sash of Persian royalty, though significantly not the full Persian court dress. He adopted aspects of Persian court ceremony, including the practice of proskynesis, ritual prostration before the king. This deeply offended his Macedonian commanders, who saw it as elevating him from first among equals to an oriental despot. The growing tension erupted in a series of violent episodes that marked Alexander's increasing isolation from his oldest companions. At a banquet in Maracanda in 328 BCE, a drunken argument led to Alexander killing Clitus the Black, the man who had saved his life at Granicus, with a spear. Afterward, Alexander was inconsolable, attempting suicide and spending 3 days without food or drink in remorse. This was followed by the even more troubling Pages conspiracy and the execution of Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew and the expedition's official historian. When a group of royal pages were discovered plotting against Alexander's life, Callisthenes was implicated in their conspiracy. His death by torture marked Alexander's final break with the philosophical traditions of his youth. Yet, even as he alienated his old companions, Alexander was pushing toward new horizons. The invasion of India in 326 BCE marked his most ambitious campaign yet. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, he faced something entirely new, an army built around war elephants. King Porus deployed these living siege engines with tactical skill, but Alexander's response showed his continuing military genius. He used cavalry maneuvers to tire out the elephants, then attacked them with javelins until they panicked and trampled their own army. Alexander's treatment of Porus became legendary. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his nobility, not only restored his kingdom, but expanded it. This gesture reflected Alexander's evolving imperial vision. He was no longer interested in mere conquest, but in building something new, an empire that could unite East and West. But the Hydaspes also marked the limit of Alexander's advance. When his army reached the Hephaestion River, they finally refused to go further. For days, Alexander sulked in his tent, trying to shame them into continuing. But even the most loyal veterans had had enough. They had marched over 11,000 miles from Macedonia, fought countless battles, and seen their comrades die from wounds, disease, and exhaustion. The tantalizing reports of great kingdoms beyond the Ganges would have to remain unexplored. The return journey proved as deadly as any battle. Alexander's decision to cross the Gedrosian desert nearly destroyed his army. For 60 days, they marched through waterless wasteland, losing as much as 3/4 of their civilian followers to heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Alexander shared every hardship, giving up his horse to walk alongside his suffering men, pouring out his own helmet of precious water into the sand rather than drink what they could not share. But the march revealed both his superhuman determination and his increasingly questionable judgment. Back in Babylon, Alexander faced the enormous task of consolidating his conquests. His methods showed both vision and pragmatism. The mass wedding at Susa in 324 BCE, where he arranged marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen, himself marrying Darius's daughter Statira, was meant to create a new Greco-Persian aristocracy. He began training 30,000 Persian youths in Macedonian military tactics, planning to integrate them into his army. But these policies caused deep resentment among his veteran Macedonians, leading to a mutiny at Opus that was only quelled by Alexander's passionate speech, reminding them of all they had achieved together. The death of Hephaestion in 324 BCE seemed to break something in Alexander's spirit. His closest friend since childhood, possibly his lover, and most trusted commander, Hephaestion, had been the only person who knew the man behind the legend. Alexander's grief was extreme. He fasted for days, executed the doctor who had treated Hephaestion, cut his own hair in mourning, in imitation of Achilles grieving for Patroclus, and ordered all horses and mules in Babylon to have their manes cut in mourning. Chapter 5. The Price of Immortality. In the summer of 323 BCE, Alexander was planning his next campaigns. His imagination seemed to grow even as his empire expanded. He intended to circumnavigate Arabia, conquer North Africa, explore the Caspian Sea, and push west into Europe through Sicily and Italy. He had ordered the construction of 1,000 warships in Phoenicia for the Arabian expedition, and his engineers were drawing up plans for unprecedented projects. A road network spanning Asia, new cities to cement his conquests, and a monumental tomb for his father Philip that would rival the pyramids. But fate had other plans. In June, after attending a celebration at the palace of Medius of Larissa, Alexander developed a fever. The exact cause of his final illness remains one of history's great mysteries. Some ancient sources blamed poisoning, possibly orchestrated by Antipata's family. Others pointed to malaria, typhoid, or the effects of his many wounds. Modern scholars have suggested everything from West Nile virus to pancreatitis brought on by his legendary drinking. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, clay tablets recording daily events, document his decline with clinical precision. For 12 days, the fever grew worse. Alexander continued to issue orders and receive reports until he could no longer speak. When his generals asked who should inherit his empire, his final words were either to the strongest, Crateros, or to Craterus, his trusted general. The Greek words are similar enough that even those present disagreed about what they heard. Alexander died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, just short of his 33rd birthday. His body lay unburied in Babylon's summer heat for days while his generals argued about the succession. According to Plutarch, his corpse showed no signs of decay, which many took as final proof of his divine nature. The aftermath was immediate and violent. Alexander had left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and his only other son was the mentally disabled Aridaeus. The empire was too vast and too recently conquered to hold together without his magnetic personality. His generals, the Diadochi or successors, soon began positioning themselves for power. The initial settlement made at Babylon attempted compromise. Aridaeus would become Philip III, with Alexander's unborn child as co-king, if male, which he was, becoming Alexander IV. Perdiccas would serve as regent, while other generals received important satrapies. But this arrangement soon collapsed into warfare that would last for 40 years. The wars of the Diadochi redrew the map of the ancient world. Ptolemy seized Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra. Seleucus eventually controlled most of the Asian territories, creating an empire from Syria to India. Antigonus and his son Demetrius tried to reunite Alexander's empire, but were defeated by a coalition of the other successors. Cassander secured Macedonia and Greece, murdering both Alexander's widow Roxana and his son Alexander IV to extinguish the royal line. Yet even as Alexander's empire fragmented, his deeper impact proved permanent. He had created a new world where Greek culture mixed with Persian, Indian, and Egyptian influences, leading to unprecedented exchanges of ideas, art, and technology. The Hellenistic age that followed his death saw innovations in everything from mathematics to medicine, from philosophy to engineering. Greek became the common language of commerce and culture across his former empire, while Greek art and architecture influenced styles from Libya to Afghanistan. The Buddha would begin to be depicted in human form, showing Greek artistic influence. Greek philosophical ideas merged with Indian and Persian concepts, creating new schools of thought. The Library of Alexandria became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Alexander's conquests also transformed the economics of the ancient world. His release of the Persian Empire's hoarded gold and silver into circulation created the first truly international economy. New trade routes opened between Europe and Asia. Cities he founded, particularly Alexandria in Egypt, became major commercial and cultural centers that would flourish for centuries. His military innovations influenced warfare for generations. The Romans would later adopt many of his tactics, particularly his combination of flexibility and discipline. His campaigns were studied by generals from Caesar to Napoleon, who each saw in Alexander a model for their own ambitions. But perhaps Alexander's most lasting legacy was the idea that the known world could be unified, that the divisions between East and West, between Greek and barbarian, were not immutable. Though his own empire fragmented after his death, this dream of unity would inspire others throughout history. The Romans consciously modeled their empire on his example. Even in the modern era, leaders have invoked Alexander's vision of East-West unity, though often forgetting the price he paid for that vision. What drove Alexander to push so far and achieve so much? Was it his mother's tales of divine heritage? His father's example of military genius? Aristotle's teachings about the superiority of Greek culture? Or was it something deeper? A desperate need to prove himself worthy of the legends he had grown up reading. Perhaps it was all of these things, combined with a unique historical moment when such conquests became possible. The man himself remains an enigma, at once a brilliant military commander, a visionary who dreamed of uniting East and West, a student of philosophy who could also destroy entire cities in fits of rage, and possibly a figure who began to believe his own divine propaganda. He was capable of both extraordinary generosity and terrible cruelty, of brilliant strategic planning and reckless personal courage, of deep friendship and murderous paranoia. Alexander died undefeated in battle, having conquered most of the known world before his 33rd birthday. The legends that began with lightning strikes and burning temples on the night of his birth have never ceased to captivate us. In his brief life, he pushed the boundaries of the possible and changed the course of history. Whether seen as a military genius, a philosophical idealist, or a ruthless conqueror, Alexander the Great remains one of history's most compelling figures. The man who tried to become a god and who, in death, achieved something very close to immortality. His story stands as a testament to both the heights of human achievement and its costs, to the thin line between ambition and hubris, between greatness and madness. In the end, perhaps that is why Alexander continues to fascinate us. In his triumphs and his tragedies, his dreams and his flaws, we see reflected both the best and worst of our own aspirations to greatness. Thus ends the tale of Alexander, son of Philip, son of Zeus, the man who dreamed of uniting the world and came closer to achieving that dream than anyone before or since. His life, though brief, cast a shadow across history that lingers to this day, reminding us of what humans can achieve when they dare to reach for the impossible.